In the last video, we kind of moved into the modern time period with Buddhism in places like China and Japan and Tibet. And in this video, I want to take us through the rest of history here with Buddhism in its homeland of India. Throughout these videos, I've mentioned several times that Buddhism will eventually almost vanish from its homeland of India. And we see that happen for a couple of different reasons. In North India, it happens primarily due to Muslim conquest. So we will eventually talk about Islam and how in the 7th century we have this new religious tradition. And by the 8th and 9th centuries, we have Muslim conquest making it all the way from the southern borders of France to the northern portion of modern-day India. So it's really an incredible and quick conquest, both politically, religiously, throughout the world. And what this meant for Buddhists in northern India is that there were some kind of bad moments where Buddhist monks were perhaps forced to flee, monasteries were burned. These aren't necessarily the ideal actions among the Muslim conquerors, but the ideals are not always followed in military conquest and political and religious conquest. So it's largely due to that Muslim conquest of northern India that the Buddhists often fled and went then further east or to Southeast Asia, depending on whether they were Theravada or Mahayana or perhaps to the north with Vajrayana Buddhism. Of course, eventually in the 20th century, we have the partitioning off of Pakistan from the northern portion of India, and now we have the conflict continued between Pakistan and India and the little region of Kashmir that is in between. So the Muslim conquest did contribute to the vanishing of Buddhism from the northern portion of the Indian subcontinent. In the south, it wasn't really due to Muslim conquest. Muslim conquerors really didn't make it to the southern portion of India. Certainly there were Muslims who made their way to the southern portion of India, but not with that kind of political and religious control. So in the south, it was more due to Hindu absorption. What that means is that Hinduism tended to absorb Buddhism so that Buddhism really couldn't survive as an alternative religious tradition. One way we see this is the way in which Hindus often started to see the Buddha as a negative avatara of Vishnu. Back when we studied Hinduism, we saw that Vishnu takes on physical form in our world to assist us. And we saw that with Krishna, the hero of the Mahabharata, or Ram, the hero of the Ramayana. But on some of the lists of Vishnu's avatars in some of the early texts is the Buddha. And the idea is the Buddha was a negative incarnation of Vishnu who was here to perhaps teach falsehoods in order to test people in their knowledge and in their faith. So when Hinduism starts putting forth this understanding of the Buddha, basically absorbing the Buddha into their own tradition and having a way to show that his teachings were not fully true, it had a big impact so that Buddhists really just weren't able to continue to thrive in southern India, and therefore Hinduism just kind of takes over and absorbs everything that was there, and Buddhism largely vanishes from the south. And this will continue really all the way up into the 20th century. And it's only in the 20th century, in the last 100 years or so, that we start to see the reemergence of Buddhism in India, a revitalization of Buddhism in its homeland. And I want to focus on 4 main factors in that revival or revitalization of Buddhism in India that really begins in the 20th century. So the first is a particular individual. His name was Ambedkar. Ambedkar was born into a lower caste and therefore would have experienced some of the caste discrimination from that side. He was eventually adopted into a higher caste and eventually became a doctor. So he was able to experience both sides of the caste system within Indian society that we have seen is largely supported by early Hindu texts all the way back to the Hymn to the Supreme Person, which said that humans were created in the caste system in our current cycle of existence. So Ambedkar had experienced both sides and comes to believe that the caste system itself is inherently wrong and unjust. So he wants to get rid of the caste system, but he doesn't believe that it is possible to get rid of the caste system while remaining devoted to Hinduism. Right? We saw some of the modern Hindu reformers, even up to Gandhi, who may have believed that it was possible to remain Hindu and yet at least defeat caste discrimination, if not the entire caste system. Ambedkar felt that the caste system was too embedded within Hinduism, so that if you want to get rid of the caste system within India, people needed to leave behind Hinduism. Now, of course, we also remember that the British believed that Christianity was the answer to India's social problems, but Ambedkar didn't want to just accept the tradition of the British. Instead, he was hoping he could find a way to remain faithful to his Indian heritage and yet to be anti-caste. And that's when he took a second look and discovered that Buddhism was an Indian religion of origin, and yet the Buddha was always anti-caste. We talked about that social egalitarianism or equality within the Buddha's message, that caste didn't matter. And in some respects, in the early days, especially with the Buddha himself, gender didn't matter. The Buddhist path was for all people. The spiritual progress that was possible for all people. So here Ambedkar discovers that by converting to Buddhism, he can be faithful to his Indian heritage by following a tradition that has its roots within India, and yet be very strongly anti-caste when it came to Indian society. Now, obviously, the conversion of one guy doesn't do much to revive the presence of Buddhism in India. So the key extra step here is that Ambedkar started leading mass conversions of Hindus to Buddhism. Now, of course, a lot of those converts were from low castes or even outcasts within the Indian society. But Ambedkar, at some moments, is leading hundreds of thousands of people at once to Buddhism by leading them in reciting the Triple Refuge and the 5 moral precepts, kind of leading them through those elements of the Dharma to help them convert to the Buddhist path. So the fact that you now have hundreds of thousands of people following Ambedkar into Buddhism in order to be anti-caste helps to revitalize the presence of Buddhism in its homeland, because now you have so many Buddhists who are energized about the Buddhist tradition within India. Second is the Mahabodhi Society. Now, this is a particular group of Buddhists from around the world who form together and decide to raise money to restore sacred Buddhist sites in India. So in the 20th century, you start getting this interest of Buddhists who live in Southeast Asia, East Asia, around the world, this interest in making pilgrimages back to these really important historical sites for early Buddhism. They wanted to go back to where the Buddha achieved enlightenment, for example, and they needed to raise money to rebuild those sites. Remember, in the north, perhaps Muslims had destroyed some of those sites, but throughout India, many of the sites had just been left behind and had become dilapidated. So the Mahabodhi Society is formed to raise money, and then, of course, to rebuild those sites and encourage pilgrimages of Buddhists from around the world to go back to India. The fact that you now have millions of people every year, including many, many, many Buddhists, coming to India to visit these sacred sites and to visit now monasteries and temples that have been built on these sites is a huge factor in revitalizing the presence of Buddhism within India. Third is the presence of Tibetan Buddhists. Now, in a previous video, I mentioned that the Dalai Lama eventually fled Tibet and crossed over the border into India due to the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And the fact that the Dalai Lama, along with many other senior Buddhist monks from Tibet, took up shop in India, built monasteries, and situated their headquarters within India helps to revitalize the presence of Buddhism in India, because now you have these very important figures, including the man who many people around the world see as the figurehead of all of Buddhism, living within the borders of India. So now people visit that spot, and you have more Buddhists from Tibet and from other places now residing in India to help revive the presence of Buddhism in its homeland. And then finally, we have what I'm calling here a change in the modern Indian view of the Buddha. Okay? So again, we had for many centuries this idea that the Buddha was perhaps a negative incarnation or avatara of Vishnu. What we start to see in the 20th century is Indians, most of whom are Hindus, taking a second look at the Buddha. And while most of them will not accept some of his spiritual teachings, they do start to appreciate the Buddha as a historical Indian figure, especially for his moral and social teachings. So again, most Hindus in India obviously will not accept some of the more specifically religious teachings within Buddhism, but they have come to value the moral and social teachings of the Buddha and see him as an important figure within Indian history, someone to, on some level, to be embraced rather than rejected or dismissed. And the fact that you have that more of an open mind toward the Buddha and toward Buddhism by modern Indians allows for a revitalization of Buddhism in its homeland. So again, you have those couple of reasons why Buddhism largely vanishes from India: the Muslim conquest in the north, the Hindu absorption in the south, and then these four really fascinating factors that help to produce a 20th century revitalization of Buddhism in the land of its origin within India.